Did you know that sometimes the greatest act of faith is not in speaking, but in the profound silence that emerges when everything around us feels uncertain, when the storms of life are crashing down, and when we feel lost, powerless, and alone? In those quiet moments, when words fail us, we are invited to embrace something much more powerful: trust. Psalm 46:10 tells us, "Be still and know that I am God." This verse isn't merely a suggestion, it is an invitation, a sacred call to rest in the knowing that God is sovereign, even when chaos surrounds us. It is an invitation to let go and trust in the divine order that operates far beyond our understanding. The simplicity of silence in these moments becomes an act of surrender, an act of deep faith that holds the power to transform our hearts and lives. If you're feeling the weight of uncertainty today, let this message be the gentle nudge you need to find peace. Silence can be the very thing that reopens your connection with God, renewing your hope and refocusing your faith. Imagine for a moment the profound peace that silence brings. In a world constantly demanding our attention, constantly pulling us to speak, share, comment, and argue, silence often feels like a foreign, almost unnatural choice. Yet it is exactly in this place of quiet, where the world fades away and all external distractions subside, that we begin to hear God's voice more clearly. For those of us who have lived through decades of challenges, loss, sacrifice, and heartache, silence can be a revolutionary choice, a space to trust without words. It is not an absence, it is an active presence, a stance of faith in a world that prizes constant action and noise. Silence becomes in this light not a retreat but a frontline defense, a powerful declaration that we are willing to surrender our need to control and allow God to take the lead in every area of our lives. Let's take a moment to reflect on the story of the Israelites at the walls of Jericho. Imagine the people of Israel marching around those great walls day after day in complete silence. The weight of their faith was not in their words or actions, but in their obedience to remain silent, to trust. For 6 days they said nothing, their steps alone resounding through the air, each one a silent prayer, a surrender to God's plan. The instruction was simple, yet impossible for most of us to follow in such moments of desperation. You shall not shout or make any noise with your voice, nor shall a word proceed out of your mouth until the day I say to you, shout, Joshua 6:10. What was it about silence that was so powerful? In a moment when they might have been tempted to question, argue, or explain, they chose to be still and trust that God's plan was more than enough. It wasn't their strategies or their strength that would tear down the walls. It was God's power alone. And when those walls crumbled to the ground, it was clear it was not their words that had accomplished this. It was God's silent, mighty hand at work. In our own lives, how many times have we felt the impulse to speak out, to justify ourselves, or to plead with God, when in truth what He is asking of us is simply to trust? Often, the hardest thing to do is to remain silent, not because we lack words, but because silence requires that we let go of our need to control. It's an uncomfortable, countercultural choice. It challenges everything in us that wants to act, to fix, to solve. But in that silence, God can do what words can never do. It may feel like we are conceding defeat, but in God's eyes, it is an act of victory. Silence is faith in motion, it says. I trust you, God, more than I trust my understanding or abilities. The beautiful truth is that this act of surrender is not just for us, it's for God's glory. Psalm 46:10 reminds us, be still and know that I am God. This is not just a command to be calm. It's a directive to recognize the majesty of God's power, to stop relying on our strength and to start relying on His. Now, let's look at the profound example of Moses leading the Israelites at the Red Sea. Picture the fear, the desperation, as they stood between the Red Sea and the oncoming Egyptian army. The Israelites cried out in terror, their voices filled with panic and doubt. But Moses, calm and confident in his faith, spoke these words, words that resonate through the ages. Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. Exodus 14:13 and 14. The silence was not an absence of action, it was an active faith. In their stillness, God prepared to part the waters and deliver them. Their silence was their faith in action, allowing God to perform what they could never do for themselves. This principle applies to us too when we face the impossible, whether in our relationships, health, finances, or emotional turmoil. God often calls us to stop striving and trust Him to fight on our behalf. It seems illogical, even radical, to sit still when our instincts tell us to act, but this is where true power lies. Think, too, of Jesus in the face of his accusers during his trial. He remained silent, not because he lacked words, but because he knew that silence would speak louder than any defense could. In Matthew 16, verses 63, we read, "But Jesus remained silent." His silence was not a sign of weakness, it was the ultimate strength. The strength of knowing that God's will was more important than any earthly argument. It was a declaration that God's plan, not his defense, would be the final word. In this silence, Jesus revealed a profound truth. Sometimes silence is more powerful than any spoken word. In his silence, he was fulfilling prophecy, showing the world that God's plan would unfold on his terms, not ours. As we journey through these sacred stories, we learn profound lessons. First, silence is not passivity. It is a powerful, deliberate act of trust. Second, silence creates space for God's voice to be heard. In a world saturated with noise and distractions, it is all too easy to lose sight of the divine whisper. But in the silence, we can tune our hearts to God's direction. Silence isn't easy. It is a choice that requires discipline, practice, and a willingness to withdraw from the world. Just as Jesus sought solitude to pray and reconnect with the Father, we too must cultivate spaces of stillness in our lives. As Mark 1:35 tells us, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. This practice gave Jesus the strength to fulfill his mission on earth. And it is through similar moments of silence that we can hear God's voice and receive the strength to fulfill our purposes. In our own lives, silence offers the clarity and peace we desperately need amid chaos. It provides a moment to pause, to reflect, to seek God, and to hear his voice. When we embrace silence as a sacred act of faith and surrender, we begin to experience God's power in ways we never thought possible. We begin to witness victories not through our words or efforts, but through his mighty hand. Just like the Israelites at Jericho, when we learn to remain silent in his presence, we open the door for God to move on our behalf. The impossible becomes possible when we trust him fully. In the silence, we discover that we are not alone. God is fighting our battles, guiding us through the storms and preparing us for victory. And when we look back and see the walls that have fallen in our lives, we will know with certainty that it was not our doing, but the Lord's. Let us take a step back from the noise and chaos of our lives and find refuge in the silence. For it is in that silence that we can truly say, this victory was his. And just as the walls of Jericho fell with the sound of a trumpet, so too will our walls fall when we trust in the transformative power of silence. A silence that is not empty, but filled with the profound presence of the living God. The story of Elijah on Mount Horeb offers a poignant reminder of the profound power that lies in silence. After fleeing in exhaustion and discouragement, Elijah sought God in the desolation of the desert. Tired and overwhelmed, he expected to encounter the divine in some grand display of power, the mighty wind, the fierce fire, or the earthquake. Yet God was not in any of these overwhelming phenomena. Instead, he spoke through a gentle whisper, 1 Kings 19:12, a subtle, tender voice that broke through the chaos in a way that no violent wind or thunderous quake could. This moment is a powerful revelation. God does not need the noise of the world to communicate. His voice, though soft and delicate, carries the strength to calm the deepest storms within us. Elijah's experience teaches us a crucial lesson. He learned that hearing God's voice requires intentionality. In a world bombarded by noise, distraction, and incessant busyness, it is necessary to pause, quiet our hearts, and create space where God can speak to us. Silence is not mere emptiness, but rather a sacred space filled with the divine presence. Just as Elijah had to turn down the volume of the world around him to hear God's whisper, so too must we. In our lives, this means setting aside dedicated moments of stillness where we can simply be with God. Jeremiah 29:13 reminds us of the depth of God's promise. You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. The act of seeking God with sincerity is not some mysterious, unattainable goal, but a tangible reality available to anyone willing to give their full attention to his voice, patiently waiting for him to reveal himself. The Bible is full of moments where God's voice is not immediately apparent, but when his presence is eventually recognized, it comes with a depth and clarity that only silence can provide. Samuel's story is one such example. As a child, Samuel slept near the Ark of the Covenant, but he did not recognize God's call at first. Instead, he thought it was Eli calling him. It wasn't until Eli instructed Samuel to respond, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." 1 Samuel 3:9, that Samuel understood. This teaches us two key truths. First, God's voice can come in unexpected moments. And second, we must be willing to listen. Samuel didn't recognize God's voice at first. How often do we too fail to hear the quiet call of the Lord in our own lives? But when we are ready to listen, to humble ourselves, God's voice becomes unmistakable. His whisper is not only a moment of clarity, it is an invitation into a relationship of trust and obedience. In the busy world we live in, the concept of rest can often seem unattainable. We live in a culture that celebrates action, achievement, and self-sufficiency, but this can leave our souls weary and restless. In moments of uncertainty, our first reaction is often to take control, to solve our problems with our strength. Yet God calls us to a different path, the path of surrender. The words of 1 Peter 5:7 echo this invitation. Cast all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. This isn't just a suggestion, it's a command to trust in God with our worries and fears, to acknowledge that we were never meant to carry these burdens alone. When we choose to remain silent before God, we are communicating to him that we trust his sovereignty and that we are willing to step back and allow him to take control. Silence in these moments becomes an act of surrender and trust, a declaration that we believe God is at work even when we don't see immediate results. Romans 12:02 urges us, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." This transformation doesn't happen in the noise of life, but in the quiet moments where we allow God's truth to replace the lies that feed our anxieties. The enemy seeks to fill our minds with doubts and distractions, convincing us that we must solve everything on our own, that we must constantly be on alert, ready to respond, to act. But the truth is that God is always present, and his plans are always unfolding, even when we cannot see them. Isaiah 41:10 assures us of this. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." When we choose to remain silent in God's presence, we are acknowledging that he is in control. Silence is not an absence of action. It is an active trust that God is fighting for us, even when we don't understand how or why. Consider the story of Jesus calming the storm. While his disciples fought against the raging winds and waves, overwhelmed with fear, Jesus was asleep in the boat. When they woke him, he responded with the simple command, "Be still, be quiet." Immediately the storm ceased, and calm was restored. This powerful act of Jesus reveals that silence is not just a tool for external peace. Amid our storms, whether emotional, relational, or physical, Jesus invites us to stop striving, to rest in His presence, and to trust that He is in control. It's not about passive resignation. It's about choosing to be still and allow God's power to bring peace to our internal storms. In Exodus 14:14, God promises us, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." In those moments of stillness, God is at work, even when we cannot see it or understand it. Psalm 46:1 reassures us, "God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble." This promise is not a mere comfort. It is a call to action. In our most difficult moments, when our hearts are overwhelmed, God offers Himself as a refuge, a place of peace, security, and rest. He invites us to bring our burdens to Him in silence, to lay them down at His feet and trust that He will take care of them. When we choose to remain silent before God, we are not ignoring our problems, but entrusting them to the one who has the power to resolve them. Matthew 11:28 invites us, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." This is not simply a physical rest, but a spiritual rest, a peace that transcends all understanding, a peace that only God can provide. As we learn to trust Him through silence, we begin to see our challenges not through the lens of fear, but with the assurance that God is working in the unseen. Amidst our storms, His voice still resounds, "Be still, be quiet." Are we willing to listen to Him? Silence, when embraced in the moments of greatest tension or difficulty, reveals a spiritual strength that defies human logic. It is a radical response to the challenges we face. In times of injustice or pain, we often feel the urge to defend ourselves, to justify our actions, to speak out in our defense. But Jesus, in the face of false accusations, mockery, and intense suffering, chose to remain silent. Matthew 27:12 tells us, "When He was accused by the chief priests and the elders, He did not answer. Then Pilate asked Him, 'Don't you hear the testimony they are bringing against you?' But Jesus made no reply, not even to a single charge, to the great amazement of the governor. Jesus' silence in the face of the trial was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate expression of His trust in God's plan. His silence revealed a powerful obedience, the willingness to submit to God's will, even when it led Him to the cross. Through His silence, Jesus showed us that sometimes the most profound expression of our faith is not in our words, but in our willingness to trust without defending, without explaining. There are moments when silence speaks louder than any words could ever do. The prophet Isaiah had already foreseen the coming of the Messiah, a Savior who would face suffering in silence, enduring unimaginable pain and injustice without a word of protest. In Isaiah 53:7 we read, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet He did not open His mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers, Sarah's silent, so He did not open His mouth." This prophetic verse paints a picture of a silence that is not a sign of weakness, but of profound strength. Jesus, the Son of God, had the authority, the power, and the right to speak, to defend Himself against the false accusations, to stop the hands of those who struck Him, to command the legions of angels to come to His aid. But instead, He chose silence, knowing that His mission was far greater than the suffering of the moment. In His silence, He was fulfilling God's divine plan for redemption, a plan that would restore humanity to its Creator. In our own lives, especially in times of trial, we are often tempted to defend ourselves, to justify our actions, to argue our point, or to explain away the accusations that others make against us. But Jesus' example calls us to reconsider our response to life's difficulties. His silence was not an absence of courage, but a choice of faith. It challenges us to trust that God is working in ways that are beyond our understanding. When everything seems to be falling apart, when the world demands a response, sometimes the greatest act of faith is to remain silent and trust that God is sovereign. Exodus 14:14 reminds us the Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. This verse does not just promise divine intervention. It invites us into a posture of trust, one that says, I don't need to control this situation. I will wait for God to act on my behalf. Consider the story of Jesus standing before Pilate and his accusers, offering us a profound reflection on the power of silence amid chaos. Jesus' calmness in the face of intense accusation speaks to a strength that could only come from a deep, unshakable relationship with the Father. In Philippians 2:8 we read, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. His silence in the face of suffering was not just an act of resistance, but an expression of profound obedience, a choice to place his trust completely in God's redemptive plan. I think of a man who, facing grave injustice in his workplace, had his world turned upside down when he was falsely accused of something he didn't do. His first instinct was to defend himself, to speak up, to prove his innocence. But as he reflected on Jesus' example, he felt a deep conviction to do something different. He chose silence, trusting God to reveal the truth in his time. This decision was not easy, but it became a powerful witness to everyone around him. His quiet resolve amid false accusations spoke volumes. Rather than reacting out of anger or frustration, he allowed God to fight his battle, and in the end, the truth came to light. His testimony inspired others to trust God in their struggles and to recognize that sometimes silence is the most powerful form of obedience and faith. This transformation is something we see in the life of Peter, a man who was once impulsive, quick to act, and slow to think. We know Peter for his flaws, his fear, his rash decisions, his doubts. But we also know him as the man who, after encountering Christ, became one of the most influential leaders of the early church. Peter's transformation was not a result of his strength, but of the work that God did in him. After Christ's resurrection, Peter preached boldly, fearlessly, proclaiming that Jesus was both Lord and Messiah. Acts 2:36. The change in Peter's life was the direct result of his encounter with Jesus. And the same is true for us. Genuine transformation comes not through our strength, but through our willingness to surrender to God's will. The process of spiritual transformation, though, is not always easy. In Hebrews 12:11, we are reminded that no discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. The discipline that God leads us through, whether through trials, silence, or moments of waiting, shapes our character, drawing us closer to His heart. It's a painful process, but one that leads to a harvest of peace. A peace that surpasses understanding and a righteousness that reflects His glory. In His ministry, Jesus often spoke of the need for transformation, urging us to remain in Him as branches remain in the vine. In John 15:04-05, He says, "Remain in me as I also remain in you. No branch can bear fruit by itself, it must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing." This connection to Christ is the foundation of true transformation. It is not through our striving or efforts that we change. It is through His power working within us that we become the people He has called us to be. Without this connection, any change we experience will be superficial and fleeting. But when we remain in Him, when we allow His Spirit to renew us, we experience lasting, eternal transformation. This transformation shifts our priorities and our perspective. In Colossians 3:01-2, we are called to set our hearts on things above, not on the things of this earth. This change in focus is not simply about ignoring our worldly concerns, but about elevating our gaze to God's eternal purpose for our lives. As we align our hearts with Him, we begin to see our circumstances in a new light, realizing that God is using every part of our journey to bring us closer to His eternal plan. In Ezekiel 37, we find the powerful image of the dry bones, a symbol of hopelessness and despair. God asks, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel 37:3. His response through His Spirit reminds us that there is no situation beyond His ability to restore. Just as He brought life to the dry bones in the valley, so too can He breathe life into our circumstances, no matter how hopeless they may seem. Through Him, everything can be redeemed and restored. As we look back on our journeys, we see that God has been at work in ways we couldn't have imagined. In Philippians 3:13-14, Paul writes, "Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it. But one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead, I press on toward the goal to win the prize for which God has called me heavenward in Christ Jesus." This goal is not a fleeting success or a temporary change. It is the eternal, perfect plan God has for each of us. The journey we are on is leading us to something far greater than we can see at the moment. Finally, when we reflect on the power of silence and its role in our spiritual transformation, we realize that silence is not just a state of stillness. It is a powerful act of faith. In the silence, we find the space where God speaks, where we can release our anxieties, and where our hearts are shaped by His presence. It is not an empty silence, but one that is filled with His voice, with His power, and with His love. It is in this silence that our transformation takes root, and we can live out His purpose with peace, strength, and confidence. But perhaps the most powerful revelation we discover in stillness is not only what God can do for us, but who He is in our lives. In the quiet, God's presence becomes tangible, His love undeniable, and His sovereignty unshakable. As we look through the pages of Scripture, we see countless examples that teach us that true strength doesn't always come in words or actions. Take Joseph, for instance, who endured betrayal, confusion, and what appeared to be abandonment. He spent years in silence, far from his family, lost in a foreign land. In the depths of his suffering, Joseph learned lessons that God would later use to save not only his own family, but an entire nation. What seemed like the darkest time of his life became the perfect stage for God to mold his character. Joseph's silence in Egypt was not a sign of defeat. It was the very environment where God prepared him for something greater than he could have imagined. How many times do we find ourselves in our Egypts, wandering without a clear direction, with no immediate answers to our prayers? These seasons of waiting can feel endless and frustrating, yet in those moments of silence, God is working in ways we cannot see, preparing us for the future He's designed for us. It's in these quiet, invisible times that God is shaping us, refining us, and teaching us lessons that will make us more like Him. Isaiah 55, 8-9 speaks to this mystery. "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." In these verses, we're invited to trust that even though we don't understand the purpose of our waiting, God's ways are perfect, His timing impeccable. The silence, though hard to bear, is part of His plan, and we can rest in the truth that God's will is always for our ultimate good. Silence teaches us something so profound. We do not always need immediate answers. Sometimes God's call is not for us to know exactly when or how things will be resolved. Instead, He calls us to trust in the outcome, to surrender our need for control and let God lead. It is in this surrender that we begin to experience the peace that surpasses all understanding. Jesus Himself in the Garden of Gethsemane demonstrated the true essence of stillness and trust. In the deepest agony of what lay before Him, He prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, May this cup be taken from me. Yet not as I will, but as you will. Matthew 26:39. In that moment, Jesus' silence was not passivity, but the profound obedience that would alter the course of history, bringing salvation to humanity. His stillness, his trust, marked the destiny of the world. In the same way, when we choose stillness, we are aligning our hearts with God's perfect plan, trusting that his will is far greater than our understanding. When Jesus stood before Pilate in the face of mockery and unjust accusations, he chose to remain silent. His silence spoke louder than any defense he could have given. Jesus showed us that there is power in calm, in trusting fully in God's timing and purpose, even in the midst of trial. How often do we forget this example in our struggles? Jesus calls us to walk in his footsteps, to follow his example of trust. By choosing to remain silent and surrender to God's will, we can experience freedom from the weight of our worries and anxieties. In Philippians 4:6-7, we are encouraged, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. This peace, which is beyond comprehension, is not something we can create on our own. It is a gift that comes only through trust, only through surrender. Spiritual renewal, like the growth of a tree, does not happen overnight. It is a process, a continuous journey where God leads us step by step. Consider Moses, who spent 40 years in the desert before being called by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. For many of us, that season of waiting may feel like wasted time. We may wonder if God has forgotten us or if we're simply stuck. But Moses' story teaches us that preparation is never wasted. Every year spent in the wilderness, every moment of quiet waiting, was God's investment in Moses. It was during that time that God shaped his character, taught him to depend fully on his direction, and prepared him for the monumental task ahead. In John 15:05, Jesus reminds us, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. This remaining is not a passive act. It's an active choice to continue seeking God, even when the answers aren't clear, even when the fruit doesn't appear immediately. It is through this continuous connection with God that we find our purpose and strength. When we choose to stop and remain in his presence, we begin to bear fruit, not by our strength, but because his life flows through us. This transformation is not only personal, it spills over into our relationships with others. Colossians 3:12, verse 14 urges us, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. This character transformation does not happen in an instant. It is the fruit of allowing God to work in us deeply and slowly over time. As we surrender to his work, we begin to reflect more of his grace, and our actions and words become a testimony to his love. In Ezekiel 37, we encounter the powerful vision of the valley of dry bones. At first glance, it seems impossible. Dead, dry bones scattered in the valley, representing hopelessness and despair. But when God speaks, these bones come to life, form together, and become a powerful army. This vision reminds us that no situation is too broken or beyond God's redemptive power. He can take the lifeless, the hopeless, and breathe new life into it. He can transform despair into hope and emptiness into purpose. But this transformation requires us to trust not just in his ability, but in his timing and his methods. It requires us to surrender fully to his will, even when we cannot see the outcome. The final invitation in this message is not a conclusion, but a call to step into the stillness, to stop amid our busy lives and to allow God's Spirit to transform every part of us. This is not just for a specific moment or season, but for our entire lives. Whether we are in a season of joy or trial, God is at work within us, shaping us into the likeness of His Son. The power of stillness is not in our hands, but in His hands. When we surrender, we begin to experience a freedom and peace that only He can offer. His grace sustains us, His peace guides us, and His love transforms us. The question before us is, are we willing to surrender? Are we ready to trust that even when we don't understand His plan, He is working for our good? When we answer with a heartfelt yes, we can be sure that God will do far more in our lives than we could ever imagine. Here are some valuable lessons. Silence as an act of faith. Silence is not the absence of action, but a profound expression of trust and obedience to God's will. By staying silent, we surrender control, allowing God to act in ways our words cannot. The transformative power of silence. Silence is not passive. It's an active, transformative moment where we allow God to work, just as He did when the Israelites marched silently around Jericho, trusting God's power to bring victory. Faith amid struggles. Like Moses at the Red Sea and Jesus during His trial, silence can be a demonstration of inner strength and total trust in God's plan, even when circumstances seem impossible. Hearing God's voice in the quiet. In a noisy world, silence gives us the space to hear God's voice more clearly, guiding us to His will. It's through stillness that we connect deeply with God and experience His presence and direction. Strength through surrender. Silence is not about weakness. It's about surrendering our will to God, allowing Him to take control of our battles and bring peace even in the most chaotic situations. What about you? What have you learned from this message so far? Take a moment and reflect. We'd love for you to share one lesson you've learned and will bring to practice in your life below this video. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more transformative content.